Hi everyone, I'm Joel. I'm from, actually I'll start off with a little bit about me before I jump into the project. Okay. I'm from Griffith University. I'm an undergraduate. I'm an undergraduate student that majors in wildlife biology and applied mathematics. And my degree's been very fruitful in a lot of ways, and that includes international travel. So I was lucky enough to be given an opportunity a scholarship with the New Colombo Plan, which is an Australian government scholarship, and that took me to I lived in Singapore for 6 months doing exchange studies. I did wildlife rescue in Vietnam for 4 months in Cook Phương. And then I studied in Japan for a little bit as well. And then finally, last year I did an internship at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which was really an awesome experience. And that was around the scientific justification for why NASA should invest in space-based animal tracking. So for you migratory bird people that I've seen present, essentially it's looking more at trying to use alternative ways, except that don't use GPS to do low rates, high accuracy um, tracking, so that you can track smaller birds. That's the main point. So for today, I'm going to be presenting on a semester-long research project that I did alongside my other studies. So it's very short and very limited in what I could actually achieve, and it won't be published. But I just wanted to share it with you guys today. So, as I'm sure you guys all know, humans have had a profound impact on global marine animal biomass, and that's through direct impacts like hunting or fishing, also through the indirect impacts of climate change. And already from hunting or fishing alone, global marine animal biomass has been reduced by 60% since the pre-industrial revolution. And it's projected to be another 5 to 15% from climate change impacts by the end of the century. We also rely heavily on fisheries for our socioeconomic purposes. We're talking livelihoods, diets, and so we rely on fisheries globally. And given that how things are going with our current net zero emissions trajectories, one might want to look beyond the year 2100, where most things are projected towards. So to do that, we use global models, and this is fairly standard practice in fisheries modelling. And to do that, we need a global model scale. We need to make simplifications, and one way to do that is using a size spectrum model. And so that makes the assumption that ecological processes scale predictably with size. And so instead of considering all individual species in the ocean, that would be way too computationally intensive, we included all on a size spectrum of predation-based growth. And you see that here. I don't know how clear it is to you guys, but so you see that from like phytoplankton and zooplankton, which have high abundance but are very tiny, all the way up to our whale species that have quite large, but there's very few of them relatively. And so to do this project, I used the bioeconomic marine trophic size spectrum model, or BOATS model. The BOATS model takes sea surface temperature and net primary production as forcings, and that's because these two factors are largely thought to influence or drive changes in global marine animal biomass, and that's due to, for sea surface temperature, that's largely tied up in the metabolic rate. So that's at an individual level, as well as transfer efficiency between predators and prey. And also there's greater energy cost associated with just doing general metabolic processes in higher temperatures, marine environments, which also relates to faster turnover as well in the ecosystem. Net primary production, on the other hand, refers to the chlorophyll being produced by phytoplankton, which is largely the base of most marine food webs, and so it can be a really good indicator of the distribution of biomass as well. So, as mentioned before, current trajectories of emissions targets aren't really being met, and so a lot of our projections are towards the end of the century, but given we probably won't be achieving net zero emissions before then, a bit pessimistic, but we'd like to look beyond the year 2100 to see, well, does it keep decreasing? Is there any changes? And those kinds of things. we'll be using the low emission scenario, the SSP 126, so like the lowest emissions, global emission scenario, and then the highest emission scenario, so we bracket all possible emissions. And in this particular study, I was only looking at the inherent effects of climate change and the emissions on global marine animal biomass, so we're not even including fishing pressure. Again, because of my short time, I had to make it quite a simplistic model that we could easily interrogate. Yeah, so running the results in MATLAB, we see that, so this here actually I should say is year, and I believe that's change biomass. So this is our baseline, our pre-industrial revolution levels, and this is our year 2025, and I've shown you the year 2100. So that's what our projection studies might show the year 2100 under the impacts of climate change, carbon emissions, not including fishing. And so you see here in the low emission scenario, after it hits net zero in 2050, I believe, it starts to level off. So the marine animal biomass is quite stable once net zero is achieved. But you see that's not the case in the highest emission scenario when we double down on emissions. And that gets us down to, I can't even see the numbers here, but it's over 30%, I think. So it's quite low. But what's interesting though is that if you look beyond this number, you see, okay, great, it's still pretty stable for the lowest emission scenario where net zero emissions are achieved. But it actually drops by another, I think, like 25% or so. But once you get to the year 2300, and I believe in this scenario, we achieve net zero emissions somewhere around here. And you can see it actually starts to level off there as well. So again, even in the highest emission scenario, we're showing that it is leveling off once you hit net zero. So we can also look at a distribution of global marine animal biomass, and I'll put it against the temperature and net primary production as well. So here on the left you have the lowest emission scenario, and then on the right you have the highest emission scenario. And so we see here for sea surface temperature, there is a general increase in sea surface temperature in the lowest emission scenario across the globe. However, it's much lower than in the highest emission scenario, where we see a much more drastic increase in temperature across the globe by 2300. Also, with the percent change in primary production, you see a redistribution of primary production. So what you're looking at, okay, it's hard to talk to these because you can't really see them that well. But essentially what you'll be seeing is certain areas that are much will have increased in biomass and areas that have decreased in biomass. And it's essentially just redistributing that. We don't look at the mechanisms that drive that change, but we're just looking at the fact that there is a redistribution in primary production. And you see, it's the same kind of trends between the low emission scenario and the high emission scenario, but it's to a much greater extent in the high emission scenario. And then finally, for our percent change in biomass, we largely see that the change in biomass, or the redistribution of biomass, largely follows the net primary production distribution. So from there, we're seeing that net primary production is actually driving the distribution of biomass, but its temperature, on the other hand, is driving the decline. So that's how those two factors are combining together to decline and redistribution. What's important here is that these are percent change maps. So the regions that have decreased by 100%, particularly down here on the right, represents much more biomass that's being reduced than in other areas where it's being increased when it was lower. So I've included here, this is the net primary reduction, I believe, in the pre-industrial levels. So you see that in the North Atlantic Ocean, for example, there's traditionally very high productivity breeding grounds, fishing grounds. But you see down here that it's the marine life there is pretty non-existent for the year 2300. And that's going to have major socioeconomic implications as well, which I'll talk to a little bit. Caveats and limitations, I think one of the biggest ones is that I'm not including fishing in this. Again, this is just the inherent impacts of climate change, but Boat's model does actually have an economic module that you can couple it with, but it also comes with its own assumptions that it needs to make, because it models fishing as an economic function of an economic function. And as well as the fact that it is a global model and you have to make these simplifications. So those are both limitations to this kind of study. And then so what I'm really trying to highlight is that climate change emissions, the impacts of climate change do not stop at any given year. No matter how many treaties we sign or anything like that, they're not going to stop at that year. It stops when we achieve net zero emissions. And doing so is vital for protecting our fisheries and then by extension the livelihoods of many across the globe. So it also highlights the importance of long-term policy action, particularly international cooperation for those maritime nations that are heavily rely on fishing as a diet for dietary needs or for the economy. They're going to be impacted more than other nations, and in doing so, they may need to sacrifice conservation and biodiversity goals in order to understandably focus on food security for their own population. So that's when international cooperation might need to step in, so that we're making sure that conservation goals aren't being compromised due to this kind of thing. Hopefully it doesn't get to this point in the first place, but unfortunately we need to be a bit realistic. And then again, future directions is including fishing. And also there is some extra things you can do with uncertainty in models, like Monte Carlo approach and that kind of stuff, and using ensembles of models to also deal with uncertainty. So that's something else, but that also requires a lot more time and computational effort than what I had available. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Do you have 5 minutes for a question? Do you have any question?
Yeah.
Information.
Well, do you ever consider the chemistry of this marine? Because it stopped emission, the chemistry will still keep change and hardly change back.
Short answer is no. we don't consider that. And again, it comes back to, given it's a global model, you need to be as simple as possible. Again, because of the computational effort required, but also because of my own time constraints. But yes, I think that would definitely be worth looking at. Largely, we're looking at the kind of those more direct impacts of climate change driving that decline. But I think there definitely would need to be additional studies to see to kind of examine those thresholds that once they've been passed, those stable. You can see the diagram in my head from my classes. Yeah.
Any question? Yep.
Thank you very much. So I understand that the previous study, they have done the similar thing, right? But until 21 century, but you predict 22 the century. So my question is to compare between the previous publication and for your finding. So which region have the greater or significant impact to the climate change in the future?
Okay, so as far as previous studies go, yes, they're into the end of the century, which, like I showed one image here, that's from Titinsa et al. In 2021. So they're they do a lot of fishery projections and that kind of stuff. I believe that's the additional 5 to 15% of impacts of climate change in this world here. So that, in that case, they're also including fishing. So I didn't have a direct comparison to some of those previous studies. As far as the regions go themselves, you have these maps here, and like I said, it's kind of hard to interpret because it's quite pixelated, but yeah, I think you'd be looking at, as far as the areas of greater significance go, be looking at, like I said here, in the North Atlantic Sea, for example, which were traditionally high productivity grounds. Once they've got to this, it's devoid of life almost. So I think that itself would be a significant result. Obviously, you can also use regional models as well, but they vary in how accurate they are. So that's kind of how I would interpret that. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chopra, for your informative presentation.
To my understanding, climate community globally have made significant progress in improving the global climate curve. To my understanding, now we have some advanced technique for downscaling
bias correction to me up to the 20th century, 2100. Even though we still have very high uncertainty for the result of climate growth, but we have high confidence in our result. But for your research, you provide projection beyond 201,000. So the question is, how can we trust the result of our climate model, of our model for the period beyond 201?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a question I asked my supervisor as well. Look, the thing about modelling is that it's only ever meant to be kind of an idea of what could happen. It's never an actual representation of the system. We can get as close as we'd like, but it's not going to tell you exactly what's going to happen because we're predicting into the future, like you said. I think there are, like I mentioned, as far as limitations go, there are ways to address uncertainty, and this is being talked about a bit more, projecting beyond 2100. There's again, I'm not really across the methods, but there's like the Monte Carlo approach and ensembles and models and that kind of stuff. So that's how you can kind of increase the reliability a little bit. But you are right. The further you get away from current present day, who knows? We could have a nuclear war tomorrow, and our whole environment's changed. So it is more and more uncertain the further away you get. I don't have a straight answer to you as far as how reliable this is. Again, I'm very limited in what I can do within my time frame, but there are ways to address uncertainty, but there's also assumptions that need to be made the further you go into the future. Okay?
Thank you, Dr. The next presentation would like to invite Mr. Vidavut from